I'm going to introduce briefly, and we keep it very brief, and then we'll have three gentlemen speaking today to talk about their experience with fundraising. And I hope that it will quickly turn into a conversation where we share experiences, ask questions. As I said in the introductory remarks, my intention is that over time this becomes a real place where we work out how to do these things. And in this case, how to raise money in order to build beautiful things, to build beautiful churches. So I'm going to give informal introductions because in getting the badges done, I failed to get ready for anything else. So you're already going to be Michael Patrick. David Gardner, I met recently, is with Gardner Hall International, and they do not only, but also very beautiful liturgical interiors, as well as residential and contract interiors. I've been working with the church for many, many years, also doing such things as vestments, as well as the design that Father Kleiman and David have worked on together at a church that I've been to many times, St. Mary's in Old Town, Alexandria, which is a very beautiful interior renovation of a space that has spectacularly transformed really the sanctuary of that church. So everything from vestments, architecture. David has a previous experience at Georgetown University, also involved in fundraising for things Catholic, and you can tell us much more about that as you like as we go.
Or a little about that.
There's a little explanation, exactly. David will be actually talking with Father Kleiman. Father Kleiman is pastor at St. Mary's in Old Town, Alexandria, and has presided over this renovation. Father Kleiman, I'm very sorry, I didn't come prepared to tell you a lot more about you. Wonderful sermons. And a wonderful human being, and a good friend. So and Luke Driscoll is with Community Counseling Services, whom I actually met through Monsignor Ensler with the Archdiocese of Washington. Luke and his firm have done fundraising specifically really for Catholic churches, as well as all other kinds of community and building types, and has a wide range of experience with fundraising. So our thought was these people, a specific project, other project-related experience, other broad experience could kick us off. David, would you like to begin?
I thought this is not to embarrass you, but I'm just thinking maybe if you would sit behind the bread. It might be easier for folks to be able to see you.
Yeah.
Not
directly behind you. You never know what happens.
Just soak up the cards.
If you didn't hear earlier, we're saying there was only actually one bagel until Father Kleiman.
Wait a minute, can change bread into the body of Christ.
But thank you very much. So we'll just get started. Again, as Michael mentioned, I'm a partner along with his gentleman Larry Ball from Gardner Hall. And in the last 5 years, the ecclesiastical side of our business has grown to where about 60% of our business by choice is now working with Catholic churches and Catholic institutions. And as Michael said, one of the things that we like to do is when we go into a space, we really like to do as much of an integrative approach as possible, and that's why we've gone into design and production of vestments, sacred vessels. It's one thing to, certainly to renovate a church, and it's another thing, as we've been doing, and actually the process with Father Kleiman started the opposite way. We started this process really with sort of restoring to the parish patrimony some traditional and period sacred vessels, things like that. And again, it's an approach that we find works very well. Jumping to what you see above you, Georgetown University's Jesuit Residence. At one point in a previous lecture, Michael mentioned, I was Director of Development for Catholic and Jesuit Identity at Georgetown. And one of the projects that we worked on during the Third Century campaign was the building of the new Jesuit Residence, which included a substantial chapel, infirmary, refectory, all kinds of things that you would expect with the Jesuits. They had been living, if any of you are familiar with the university, the old Jesuit Residence was really 3.5 buildings cobbled together over the years. Really just inefficient, some lovely rooms, but none of which were ever designed really to house 50 Jesuits. And so during the Third Century campaign, it became one of the priorities to rehouse the Jesuits in something that would, in a structure that would not only lend itself well to the purpose of the Jesuits, but if the population of Jesuits continued to shrink, something that could be used as an honors house or studies house for other programs, and so that the building could be adapted. very traditional campaign, and as Larry said to some of you on the way in, all these ideas are great, but nothing happens without money. Georgetown at that point decided that the campaign, the third century campaign, would be a campaign for $250 million. Very quickly, during the feasibility study, we realized we had the capability of raising a lot more. So we doubled the campaign to $500 million, and approximately 50 of that was earmarked for Jesuit Catholic projects, one of which was the residence. At that point, it was a $15 million project. It was the classic development, development program: feasibility studies, consultations, solicitation during the quiet phase with major donors. So, we did everything right. We had half of the money in hand before we announced that this was part of the capital campaign itself. So everything was done by the book, and everything went smoothly, and it was all very pleasant until we got to the actual design of the building. And if you think working with parish councils is a problem, imagine 50 Jesuits. It was really quite a lengthy process, and of course everyone had in the egalitarian culture in which we live, the society really wanted everyone to have a voice to say. So it was a tedious process, but a good one in that what came out was a project that and a residence that is well suited to their needs. Again, just a classic capital campaign, and this being a microcosm of that. As Luke will probably tell you in more detail, there are all kinds of ways about going after money for these projects, and some of which are not structured as what I just described at Georgetown. Another project which I'm going to discuss and show a couple of photographs of in a minute is St. Peter's on Capitol Hill. St. Peter's had a renovation in the church. There was one in the early 60s, one in the late 60s, one in the 70s, and one in the 80s. And when Father Byrne, who's currently the pastor there, arrived, the first thing that bothered him was his chair. And then from there he began to look around and say, the chair is uncomfortable, the chair isn't worthy of the building. What else in here is not worthy of the building? And so he called together a building committee, and then contacted my firm to come in and just sort of examine the place and kind of look around and make some recommendations. It evolved into basically a wish list, a laundry list of what the priests and a very well-selected building committee of 5 people put together. It was concise, it was clear, and then we put budget figures to all those items. We realized then that there was more money to be had in the parish, and so we sort of pressed the envelope a little bit and decided, well, let's tackle this. Let's do a mini campaign here and see what likely could we raise. And with the help of the diocese and with the help of the parish council president and some other folks, we decided we could raise a lot more than we thought. And even though it's a very small project, this is $15 million. We're now talking about $125,000. However, for a lot of parishes, this is a big stretch, and it's something that's unattainable. The parish was lucky enough that it had more than half of what it needed before we even finished working on our wish list, because Father knew the right folks to tap. And then, as I said, from starting with the chair, we then moved into restoring the main altar, which had been badly cut and pulled out. When the altar was pulled out to face the people, essentially they left a gaping hole on the what had been the reredos under the tabernacle and put a radiator cover over it. So it was a series of these kinds of things. A very handsome church nonetheless, but a series of things. And so people were very excited because they wanted to rectify some of these issues a long time ago. So again, it was, I hate to use this word, but it was an easy campaign. Once they saw the first thing happen, which was just restoration of metalwork, then people, the donations started coming. Again, it was largely due to Father's foresight and making sure that they had enough substantial major donors to begin with. With that, I'm just going to show you photographs of the project. There. So you can see, this is the chair that Father sat in on his first Sunday and decided, no, this isn't worthy of a lowly Romanesque revival church like this. You see, this is the ambo. which some of the parishioners described as a faux painted garbage can. And I don't mean to insult the person who made it, because it's very well made, but it was just, again, it was, it's of a period of a piece. So again, the wish list started to include metalwork. It started to include restoration of the tabernacle itself. It included a series of things, which I'll show you, designs, again, that were sort of put together, thrown up to the parish. First were chairs. You can see here, basically, we just lifted a design from one of the side altars and created an integrated set of furnishings, chairs, previews, credence tables. Again, taking elements of the church. This poster was put in the back of the church. People just simply asked Father how much. Numbers were attached to it, and the donations came rolling in. So again, small project, but then it began to, again, expand a little bit so that we get to the point where we wanted to do something with the radiator cover on the main altar. So what we did, again, discussed was something permanent, something in marble. Again, went back to the drawing boards, came up with a budget, and then Father went to several people that expressed an interest in making some major gifts. So these two pieces, this and the new ambo, which is mounted on a Renaissance pulpit, actually shrunk down, incorporated marble, but also incorporated the pieces of the old altar gates. What you see in that grill work actually are the centers of some very, very handsome bronze grill work that was in the altar gates of the original altar rail. So again, it was just a matter of starting with one piece, telling people how much it was, and then again, sort of things just snowballed from there. Very much opposite the way we did things at Georgetown, but nonetheless effective. Then I'm going to introduce, as I said, we're going to leave Father Kleinman. I'll show you first what Father Kleinman's church looked like. This was, this is the sanctuary before the renovation. And again, like St. Peter's on Capitol Hill, renovations in the 60s, 70s, 80s. The church, while it has, the building itself is significantly Gothic in its elements, the original altar and tabernacle, as you can see, were neoclassical. And one of the difficulties that, when we first looked at this project was, well, we're going to have to do something substantial to deal with what was removed, above the altar, the main altar. And so it was decided after a series of meetings with Father Kleinman, Father DeSalle, Father also had some other folks that he consulted with on the process, that we would engage in something sort of a modified Jesuit Southern Maryland thematic to the project. Because it was
Southern Maryland.
Yeah, this was a Jesuit parish at one time, and so the original altar was very typically Jesuit. Main altar, baldacchino, large painting, very typical for Jesuit parishes. And so again, even though the shell of this church received these Gothic elements after one fire or another, and it was rebuilt, the original altar and tabernacle, really, that demanded everything that needed to be done had to take its origin point there. And so again, in this consulting process, and I'll let Father speak to this a little bit more directly, we began to do some, come up with some renderings and some ideas, and then Father began to share that with some of the folks in the parish, particularly one person who became excited about it. You'll see now, let's get over to what the church looks like today. Okay. And this is St. Mary's today. The marble reredos and the new altar of repose, pediment, seal of the Society of Jesus, proudly emblazoned above all else, which is again typically Jesuit. Statues have been returned to the sanctuary. And again, all these things fueled people's interest. So the project actually began to grow and expand, and we were able to do a lot more in one fell swoop than we thought possible at the beginning. Again, because the interest was there, people liked what they began to see, and even down to the new floors, the carpet's all gone, except in the side aisles where we did a custom carpet. But again, this is about money, so I'm now going to turn this over to Father and let him explain to you how he raised the money for this.
Well, it's just a little additional background on this and how this all kind of came together.
St. Mary's is the oldest parish in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and oh, it's gone.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think we had the wider view
Here,
here, but
I'm sorry, folks, just one second.
You go to desk.
Yeah.
There you go. And then go back to the ALP if there is one bolt.
There we go. I'm not good at this mouse, folks, I'm sorry. There we go.
you actually can't see it, but off to my left, to your right, to the side here, the Blessed Mother's, there's a shrine. And in probably the very late 60s, very early 70s, when they did some major renovations to the church, they moved the statues out of the sanctuary, moved the Blessed Mother into this side chapel area, which had been the Sacred Heart Chapel, moved the statue of the Sacred Heart to the back of the church, and where there was an old confessional at one time, which was gone, and it's a little cubbyhole type of thing. And the statue of Joseph, St. Joseph, was moved to another kind of the opposite side of the church, where the baptismal font had been. So it had been the baptistry, which was long moved to the front, which you can see off to the corner there, near the Blessed Mother. But so they made some major changes, and some time ago they put in electric candles, as many churches have done. The vigil lamps, that, people push the little button, put their coin in and push the button. And for the most part, St. Mary's is a rather traditional parish. People were not particularly fond of the electric candles. And I mean, this might seem like a minor thing, but this is how this all started. The fire marshal has been insistent over the last number of years with the size of the congregation and the amount of people that are typically in the church that the electric candles are the better way to go. For the fire hazard or whatever. But in the shrine area, it would have been easy to just kind of close it off. We intended to put marble in there, marble flooring. It already had a tin wall with fleur-de-lis on it. And so gated off with kind of, an altar type of structure. Put a marble floor and real candles in that back area. And the fire marshal was okay with that because it was closing it off from the rest of the church. So a few people had just given some money, had heard about the idea. There was no effort to raise money. When another individual called and asked if, or told us he was going to make a donation, somewhat substantial, not huge, but was wondering what it could go towards in the church. He wanted it specifically designated for something, and I told him what our plans were with this little shrine and area here. And he said, why do you want to stop there? He said, why don't you do the whole sanctuary? In fact, he said, why don't you do a major restoration similar to the effort, if you're familiar with the Basilica of the Assumption in Baltimore, where they, under Cardinal Keeler, did a complete restoration, or at least nearly complete restoration, back to what the original intent was. And he was somewhat familiar with individuals involved with that, and happens to know the Bishop of Arlington as well, and so asked permission from me and the bishop if that could be explored, which the bishop gave his blessing on, and I said I was fine with. So he, on his own, with his own funds, hired the architect from New York who had redesigned the Basilica in Baltimore. And about 6 months into the process, and realizing this would be a multi-million-dollar project, if we really, truly were to restore the church back, it had a vaulted ceiling. You can't see that very well in this picture, did either, but Dave mentioned a fire. There had been a fire there in 1906, and all the charred rafters are still there. They just put a false ceiling in to cover all that so it didn't have to be repaired. It was still structurally sound. But again, this would have been a major financial undertaking if we were to do that, but the bishop decided we weren't going to do that. So that ended that process. And so what we decided to do was just basically put marble down on the floor in the sanctuary. And in the meantime, we're working with Gardner and Hall, as David mentioned, some other items, just some vessels and other things. And but this thing started to gel from there. That when the bishop said we were not to do this major restoration, we said, well, could we at least have permission for the sanctuary floor? We come up with a few other ideas. We move the statues back into the sanctuary. And he gave his blessing and all that. We threw out the idea of possibly moving the baptismal font back to where it originally had been, the baptistry area. Talked about, as David showed you, actually the main aisle, making all that marble as well. Again, just threw out a few other possibilities. Suggested an altar rail as well. And basically the bishop gave permission on everything except the altar rail. So, but he said it could be reconfigured, and you can't really see from that perspective there, but he said reconfigure it so it could eventually go in, but don't put it in at this time. So that's really where everything kind of started, and this individual who was involved, who again kind of came up with this idea, ended up being the major benefactor behind the project. And word spread that we were going to do this. It just kind of evolved in many ways as to how far we're going to go and what exactly we're going to do. So it is a partial restoration in the sense where the woodwork is in the back. You notice in that original picture there wasn't on there, but there originally had been. So the mahogany wood there is back to somewhat similar to what it had been. The framing around the crucifix, as David mentioned, there originally was a picture of the crucifixion, which no one knows what that is anymore. It was a beautiful rendition of it, but it's disappeared. Of course, there were side altars. We had actually mentioned about that too. It was we moved the statues in if we could have them on side altars. And the bishop said no to that, but said pedestals, and that's what you see there, of course. So again, as far as just the planning process, that's where all that came from and went. As far as the financial fundraising, thankfully, somewhat similar to the way it sounded, although we probably did it even a little bit more at St. Peter's. We did no official fundraising, and some other monies came in, and when people saw what the project was, you saw the conceptual drawing, when that was put on display, similar to what Dave was saying with St. Peter's, when they put that picture of the chairs and things out, more money came in, and so people were, for the most part, behind it. There's always a couple of people that you're not going to please. There were some that voiced their concerns. And, but again, we have about 12,000 parishioners, and we had probably 4 people who weren't particularly happy with where it was going. So, but certainly wanted to listen to them too, and everybody's opinion is certainly valid and worth listening to. Not necessarily something we're going to follow, but, and again, a couple of them were, I would say, rather unreasonable. Some were valid, and again, we did try to at least accommodate that. But as far as the actual fundraising, it just came in without. I did have to make one phone call to someone that the first individual. He solicited him, and just he wanted a follow-up phone call from me, and so truly, it's other than having contact with the original benefactor here, contributor, I had one other phone call as far as fundraising was involved, and the rest of the things kind of came in. We did need to use some parish funds as well. It wasn't an entirely parishioner-financed campaign here, but as it was a 10-week project. We're not talking huge amounts of money by any means. The whole project was under $200,000 actually, so it, peanuts of course, but people have been very pleased with it. In fact, once it was done and they saw what you're seeing, people are just, in fact, I'm not aware of anyone who is not at least somewhat happy, if not entirely happy, and very pleased with where it has gone in the direction that we try to take it. And ultimately, you know, it's all for the glory of God, and that was the whole point, is to lift our souls even more so with the setting that we had here to the glory of God, to provide a more prayerful place for Mass, certainly, but just to worship as you're watching or you're seeing adoration here in front of us. But and that seems to have been accomplished, and thankfully, and
I have my own theories I'll share with you later about some sort of implicit fundraising that was going on all the time. But not implicit, but sort of almost natural kind of stuff. But thank you, and maybe we turn it over to Lou.
sure.
Okay, let's see how we do mouse competition. Good morning, everybody. This is really exciting for me to be here. Actually, the last time I was on campus, I was with my soon-to-be ex-girlfriend, freshman year. I didn't know that at the time. But I called her before I came in, so it's still good terms. But just want to talk a little bit about sort of fundraising, just as a little brief explanation. I'm a regional vice president with a company called CCS. We'd be the largest of all the fundraising firms in the U.S. We have about 250 employees. We were founded in 1947 in Brooklyn by actually a pair of guys that came back from the war, and they started doing parish campaigns. They looked around and saw that other organizations in other faiths there were organized fundraising activities other than sort of the big sales and special collections and special events, that they were doing things in more of a kind of a business-like way, systematic way. And so we started from that point and really, we're almost, people thought the community counseling service, that one of the C's meant Catholic, because we had so much Catholic clientele. We still, this time, probably 60 some odd years later, still about close to 25%, even though a third of our business is still in the Catholic world. These are just some, besides Catholic clients, we also work with many other different types of clients. We probably work with about 250 or so clients a year. We have a couple offices around the country. But it's one of those things for myself. I've been with them for 19 years, and I've probably spent, I'd say, a good 2/3 of my professional life doing campaigns for either individual parishes, churches, whether they're Catholic or other faiths, as well as probably working with about 7 or 8 dioceses and archdioceses, including, I was one of the people that was involved on the Archdiocese of Washington's campaign, which we did several years ago, that raised about $185 million. Just to give you some folks a sense of philanthropy in the U.S., a lot of times, people will sometimes think about where the big gifts come from. It still comes from people. A lot of times people will think, oh, well, companies or foundations make big gifts. They do, but it's pretty much about 80% comes from individuals. Individuals do 75% requests. Individuals that are no longer with us also make 7% of those gifts. And foundations, you can see, and corporations at 13.5%. It's interesting, this figure has held fairly constant over the past 40 years. It's not changed that much, even with all the kind of different creation of wealth. It's remained roughly the same. This will just give you a sense of where the money comes from, or where it goes to, rather. Good news for us, 35% goes to religion. And this number's pretty much held fairly constant too, anywhere from about a low of about 31 or 32% to about 37, but pretty constant when it's been evaluated over the years. Other things over in the past probably 10 or 20 years have grown. Haven't really eaten in too much of the share of the religion piece, as you might expect. People, in terms of their giving, it is a deeply personal thing. For most people, their faith is one of the most important things to them, and as well as, unlike a lot of these other institutions, they interact with their parish or their church sometimes on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis or more, whereas some of these other organizations are going to be far more sporadic. Just one of the things that you're going to need to have in any campaign, your father and Dave talked a little bit about how things worked on the projects they worked on. But really there's sort of 4 aspects, and these are fairly consistent, not just for parish campaigns, but really for all organizations. You need to have the right people involved, the right leadership. You need to have enough prospects, or in this case, potential donors to support what you're doing. You need to have a plan. Sometimes the plans kind of happen organically. And like Dave was saying, you know, we had started with a chair, and then all of a sudden said, well, let's do this, let's do that. And because it kind of struck a nerve with everybody, it kind of grew on its own. But more often than not, when you're doing a larger project, you know, for a parish campaign, not some of these, you know, more discrete projects, maybe a multi-million-dollar project, you really need to have a very specific plan going, and a lot more like Dave was talking about in the Jesuit Residence. It needs to be done in a very thought-out way and a thoughtful way. And that's really the case for support, and the reason why we're raising the money. Just clear, unlike the image to the right, apparently. The importance of the case, I mean, there's a couple basic things. That it needs to be clear, it needs to be easily understood, it needs to be concise, it needs to be something that's not overly complex, folks can understand what it is. You need to be able to show a demonstrable impact. I think, you know, when you have some pictures and things where that really tells the story, how the lighting preps and some of the shots we saw earlier, how the difference of the experience after the renovation is done. Whenever that can be either expressed in words or even better in pictures or drawings or graphics, it really visually helps people understand how their gift can make a big difference and an impact. And really one of the things that we need to do whenever we ask anybody for money is we've got to answer some key questions. So why are we doing this? Why now? And maybe kind of also implied why that much that you're asking me personally for that. But if you can answer those questions in a sort of in a way that folks can understand that, you can have a very successful effort. Here's the things that, one thing I really like in doing campaigns when we get a chance to actually build a new church. It's actually a fairly unique thing. It doesn't happen very often, as you might expect. Sometimes what will happen is, a lot of times in this area of the country, there were a lot of churches that were built probably in the 50s and 60s. In some cases, they were built more as parish halls that kind of, some elements were thrown in to make it sort of the gymnasium, massatorium, you know, sort of a combination of elements. We've all been in these churches. So sometimes because it's not possible to build a brand new church, either from the monies that are required or just demographics, it doesn't make sense to build a new edifice, there's renovations that go on. That happens a lot more often than not. But when you get a chance to get involved where they're building a new church or really doing significant renovations, from a fundraising perspective, it's really exciting. It's really exciting because you can help show people and tell that story. Now, we heard some of the challenges that Dave and Father kind of cited. You can see here too in terms of what you're going to face. These kind of projects, you know, typically if you're building a new church, particularly now different parts of the country, sometimes you're building almost not mega churches, but much larger churches that can handle larger numbers of parishioners. So those kind of projects take you anywhere from 10, 12, even $20 million. You know, they're really significant. If you think about an area that's a lot of people, it probably needs other services too. You know, parish hall, meeting space, space for religious education, space for events, perhaps a school, any number of things. So these projects can be really big projects. You need to have a significant amount of participation. Now the challenge that you'll find in campus, if you have the right case, particularly if you're either building new or doing a significant renovation, you can get a fairly high level of participation, about 50% or even better. You can get those types of campaigns where it really resonates with folks. As the projects we heard about earlier was great because it happened over a fairly tight time period. But if you're doing something really significant with all the permitting and land clearing and different things that need to happen, that's kind of the tough thing. You can do the campaign, raise the money, but keep everybody excited and focused before the end product is there is sometimes a challenge to do. And as Dave said, and Father commented, never easy to get consensus on what it's supposed to look like. And you can never, Father, if you only had 4 people, as long as they weren't the 4 people that funded the majority of the activity there, you're probably okay. But that's the challenge, is that, it's one of those things, and any of you that are in the design field, it should be this color or this color, and these are people who don't actually, it's blue, it's yellow, it's up, it's down, it's totally subjective. But when you can invite people to participate, and if it's not too unwieldy, it is helpful, because at the end of the process, people will have felt like, at least I was heard. Maybe they didn't go with what my suggestion was or what I really liked, But there was some discussion about what this was and why we were maybe perhaps choosing one direction or the other. That is a community after all, and it's important to do. I think the opportunities, when you're doing either new building or renovation, it's possibly the strongest case you can have for fundraising. It's something that's extremely powerful in terms of the type of imagery you can show with people. It's transformative, where we saw some photos before and after type of thing. A lot of times you'll find some churches, particularly at least here in the Mid-Atlantic area, they'll either the lighting or they'll be dark with the paneling, where it's just very dark. And just even sometimes with some simple things with some paint, better lighting or windows, it can just make a total difference in terms of the experience. There are donor recognition opportunities whenever you're doing some significant renovations or new construction. You have an opportunity where somebody, we heard earlier, the altar was something that was very powerful and it meant something to them, so they wanted to help contribute towards that. Now, typically in larger campaigns, the person's gift wouldn't go towards the actual cost of the item. It'd be more sort of attractiveness. So sometimes, in some cases, you could have somebody making a gift to support something that their gift is in fact much larger than the actual cost of the item. But the idea is the appeal of it, the visibility of it, and the importance to that. That's why frequently you'll sometimes see, even here on campus, I'm sure there's chapels that are named after families. The chapels themselves are not particularly sizable things, but because of the power of what they represent, you can get people to make some really significant gifts. And that goes to the leaving a legacy that folks typically at parishes, many times they've been there for if not years, decades. And this is something that it's sort of intrinsic to their being. This is something folks want to be able to say, the people before me gave me the facility and the church and the grounds. I want to make sure that the next generation either has that or even has something better. Pictures tell the story. That's the kind of thing. This church on the left, I couldn't for life of me last night find the original picture. Picture that really dark. They actually had some of that awful wood paneling some of us had in our parents' basements. They had that kind of wood on the sides. That back window was not stained glass, but sort of colored glass. That's sort of very 60s kind of, faux stained glass, which again, made it just very dark. And once they changed it, it just literally illuminated the whole space. The cathedral, this is the cathedral in Baltimore with Mary our Queen. This was a project that I worked on where we did some significant renovations to stabilize the windows. Those of you who are not from the area, and those of you who are in the area, if you ever want to make a quick trip to Baltimore, which is sometimes an hour away, a little more than that, but there's two places that, thinking of the theme of today, they're literally worth your time to go do this. Even better on a Sunday, so you can go and see the Mass as well. But to go to the cathedral, it is an impressive place. They have tours as well, and there's the parishioners there give tours. There's a story with every stained glass window. There's elements left and right. It's a neat place. And this building was built out of philanthropy. Back during the Great Baltimore Fire, and someone who knows history better than me will remember the actual date. But when there was a huge fire in Baltimore, there was a very significant prominent Catholic who owned one of those big stores in town. He was staying and trying to protect his store downtown. He was doing the thing that all of us will do. God, please help save the store and all my friends and family here, and I'll build something in your honor. And so actually made a very, very significant gift at the time in his estate. When it came to fruition, it actually helped to build the cathedral completely on philanthropy, as well as Good Samaritan Hospital in Baltimore. But that's a very interesting place to go see. The other place we heard was the Basilica. That's actually another client of CCS, as well as Bishop Liberty, so it's always nice when I hear people that we work for. But the Basilica is fantastic. Benjamin Latrobe did the Capitol building here, also did that at the same time. He was probably the first original Baltimore, D.C. commuter, because he was doing both projects at the same time. I do it in a car, on horseback. I can't imagine what that would be like. But it really, the Basilica is an amazing place that way, in that it again was very sort of dark, had lots of marble and different features, just amazing history to it. And when they did the renovations, they took the stained glass windows and they took them out and went back to the original design, which were these sort of clear plate windows. In addition, they have a big rotunda, or is it an ocular date? I'm not sure what they oculus. Yeah, see, the layperson here, man, thing. Up above, they have this dome that has these windows, very thin windows all around that bring natural light and kind of bathe the whole space in it. So it really is actually an amazing space to be in, because on a day like today where it's pretty sunny, but there's the occasional clouds, the actually color and lighting in the room will change based on what's going on in the cloud of the sky. So it's really a fascinating place. There's all sorts of other fun little elements when you go in a place like that where the guys read the plans wrong. So you go down in the undercroft and things are, you know, the bricks go in the wrong direction. And there's all sorts of, I think, really neat things where you can see the difference. Those of you who don't want to do that, actually, they do have a little video thing online. It's very cool. But that was a process where we not only engaged people in Baltimore, but Catholics around the United States, because that was the first cathedral in the United States. So it's really, if you have the right case, it's very strong. Just a kind of couple other things, and I'll get out of your hair here. Here's some things that we think are really important when you're doing fundraising, particularly parish-based fundraising. Personal gift requests versus just sort of general appeals are much more effective in terms of asking people to get involved, to get engaged. And whenever you can have a private discussion with people on a one-on-one basis, it does a couple of things. It raises a level of importance that if I come to talk to Dave, obviously I've asked for time on his schedule, I've made time out of mine. We're not talking in the parking lot after church. You know, we're sitting down having a meaningful conversation. It also kind of gives respect to the process. That for most people, they're giving, if it's not something very small, here's $10 for your kid's Boy Scout troop. If it's something significant, it should be done in a setting they feel comfortable, and it's a private setting. Campaigns are best done in a phase-by-phase approach when you're doing a campaign with many parishioners that it's involving the whole parish. You can't attack it all at one time, so you need to do it in sort of a systemized way, where you want to do is sort of approaching some of the top prospects first. So that kind of goes to the next thing, where you can see proportionate but not equal gifts, meaning that we're not going to just say, well, we have 1,000 families, so if everybody gives $500, we can do it. It makes sense mathematically, but we live in a country where everyone's allowed to vote, and less than half of the people do. So, you know, it's something where that you have to sort of approach it in a way that, you know, all of us don't have the same resources. So we can go to some of those early on to help generate some momentum and excitement and credibility to the project. Particularly when you're doing a multi-million-dollar effort, it's very beneficial. And then the idea is then you can engage further people for broad participation. I think I mentioned earlier how important that is. We always encourage pledges that people, for these larger gifts, instead of a one-time gift, they could spread it over a period of time. Typically, they do it over a 3-year period, sometimes for the larger gifts. And larger might be, you know, 10,000, 25,000 or more. They'd encourage people to think about over a 5-year period. And then prayer is something that, you know, not that we personally sort of invoke that when we work with clients, but we do encourage that meetings and events should open and close with that. It's respectful of the process. Philanthropy, as I mentioned earlier, is something that's deeply personal for a lot of people. And, you know, when we're training volunteers to ask somebody to say, hey, we'd hope you'd make a prayerful decision about that. It is respectful. We hope they'd stop and think about what they're doing and how it means for their family and what they're doing for the church and for the great glory of God. Good thing, too, this is not listed here, but in terms of pledge payments, in terms of people fulfilling their pledges, parish campaigns, unlike any other campaigns, are the highest level when you say the word redemption. But pledge collection usually is somewhere between 92% and even as much as 95%. So it's unlike other types of campaigns, which might be in the 80s or even lower, because you don't have as much transition. People aren't moving in and out. If even somebody does move away, they'll treat their commitment to their parish as something they'll want to fulfill versus they might not think the same way about a hospital or some other entity. It's kind of the last couple of this piece, but I think the only other thing I was just going to add that I kind of heard in Dave's comments, one of the things whenever you're doing campaigns for either renovating space or building new space and sort of the old worship space maybe going away, whenever you can think about how you can thoughtfully repurpose some of those elements, that's very appealing to parishioners and donors. That either it can be something that could be, as they did, sort of reincorporated into a very prominent element. Sometimes there may be a side chapel that it can be used for some of the key elements, or they even can be used with another church. It could be a needy church, or it could be another new church. That if you think about some of those in a new design of a building, even though the old windows may be beautiful, they just might not fit the new design. It might not be practical to keep them up. So we saw that with the Basilica, where in Baltimore, when they took those windows out and put back these sort of clear glass windows, the majority, if not all, the stained glass windows went to St. Louis and Clarksville. which is a big parish in Howard County that was building a big new church, and they used those windows. So again, it's one of those things where those things don't go away. People have some of those emotional attachments to things. So however you can do those types of things, I think it before, but also tries to incorporate in a way that doesn't, you're not kind of putting something that doesn't fit into the new space. But that was just sort of some broad-based, comments and anecdotes. Unless anybody has any questions.
Yeah, let's just actually thank you, first of all, just I've got things I can shoot out, but I'd rather just see what questions you guys have first, experiences you've had with fun. How many people here actually do or have done some kind of fundraising already? We got two. You got there, okay. And then, so most of it's going to be questions about fundraising. What's on your mind? What are you guys trying to learn? What challenges are you facing? What questions do you have?
For people that are involved with kind of the project management part of the process, there's always a tension within my own diocese between fundraisers, my staff, and architects. What kind of information do fundraisers need to be effective when they're trying to help a parish put together a case statement so that the project managers are not backtracking when they're actually having to do the project and there's that gap between expectation and the delivery of the project?
Sure. I see you're from my original home diocese. Manhasset guy.
Oh, there you go. Same thing.
Small one, exactly. I think it depends on the nature of the project, obviously. I have to say, it's a shame you're having some problems that way, because that was usually the first person I would call would be, the architect or design people, because it just helps tell the story. I think one of the things that is helpful, not essential, but is helpful when you can kind of understand some of the planning process. If it was okay with the parish, frequently when I ran the campaigns myself, I would ask if the architect would come through and walk through the space with me and tell me what was going to happen. Because if you can kind of help put those things into words, and it's interesting that the pastor might have a tough time kind of conveying it in sort of that helps with the fundraising. We can talk about the spirituality or what it means for the community. The architect can talk about some of the practical things and how it means. So, I mean, if someone is sort of in our shoes, hopefully our job is to be able to listen to both and sort of put forward a kind of a story, an image, and an understanding of what this is. So I think things understanding about the scope of a project in terms of the total cost, when we come in, is it something that the parish is going to be able to do all those things, or is what is on the docket sort of the dream, versus maybe we're going to try to raise as much money as we can, and then we're going to see what we can do. But again, any kind of information, and I always find that if there's an openness on behalf of the folks who are doing design and planning piece of it, it's extremely helpful. And our job hopefully should be to help convey that, whether it's using some of the images that people can do, whether it's designs, whether it's kind of before or after shots, all those types of things are extremely helpful.
And my follow-up question would be, one thing that I try to do is to kind of pull the case histories of what things actually cost from project to project. Do fundraisers, as they're kind of scoping the ability of a parish to raise money, are they also kind of looking globally at parishes, not only for their capability to fundraise, but the actual cost of what actual campaigns and then construction costs, so that they can see what success and failure rates are going to be? I get the sense sometimes that that's hit and miss on the fundraising side of that equation.
I think it's always sort of demographics are going to tell the story too, in terms of the size. I mean, there's a little bit of parish math that we always do. There's in terms of how many registered parishioners versus that are actively financially supporting the parish. And not that the folks that are on the books, but not supporting the parish regularly won't give, but it can give you sometimes a false sense of security. Oh, well, we have 4,500 registered families, but there may only be 1,800 or 1,900 regularly supporting it. So you can't necessarily build your plan on the 4,500 number, but you have to kind of look at those that are actually currently supporting it. Historically, we've seen parishes can raise anywhere between 3 and 5 times their annual offertorium campaigns. But in special circumstances, particularly if you're doing something like a major renovation or a new church, there can be opportunities to raise sometimes 5, 7, even 10 times that amount. So I think when you put a plan together, one has to be based on the number of people supporting the parish, and then you have to look kind of deeper within. That's where working with the pastor, working with some of the lay leadership that are really close to it. Are there a handful of families that could make very significant gifts? You could have 2 people that are both giving $100 a week to the parish. One could be a retired school teacher, one could be the biggest developer in Northern Virginia. You would know that just kind of looking names on a list. And that's the kind of thing we have to think about. Are there some families or individuals that might be able to make really significant gifts that could make a difference in this? So I think when putting a plan together, it has to factor in what existing demonstrated support there is. Are there any people sort of, I won't say hiding in the weeds, but people that are potentially, can make significant, and would have an interest in doing that? So there, and that's kind of, I mentioned the sort of, typical metrics that we would see historically. What we have seen is more people, smaller numbers of people are giving larger amounts of money. So in some cases, there's less people giving, but giving larger amounts.
I was actually to throw in a comment. I mean, in the first few stories we heard, I kept hearing things like, well, we went out there to get some money, and all of a sudden we realized we could get double what we thought. And we went for so much, and all of a sudden now that's interesting. So what's going on out there? And is this a common experience across the country, or what's?
Well, at least in what we found, mostly, not just at Georgetown, but mostly parish work, there's, and I don't know what this is like for other denominations, but particularly in the Catholic world, there's something underlying this, and that is whether it's a residence for the Jesuits, whether it's a renovation of a star church, a new church. Unlike the rest of culture and civilization, the Catholic mind, the Catholic heart, the Catholic soul believes in objective beauty. That things aren't just subjective. That this is a pretty house, this is a pretty church, there's something deeper on the part of a Roman Catholic. And so if there's an instinct, now the form that beauty takes can vary, but we do believe in objective beauty. So what I found is the minute you touch the Catholic imagination with something that they, sometimes they can't even articulate it or don't understand it, but they know that there's something divinely inspired. I'm not talking about my plan, Father's plan, but something about whatever the project is, if it enhances the liturgy, worship, and people's experience of God, then it's beautiful. There is an objectivity. People get excited about that because it reaches right into the very heart of what it means to be a Catholic Christian. The other thing, too, that we found is that, when Catholics are reminded, and Luke will probably, this I'm sure will resonate with what you do, it's a precept of the church that we support our parish churches. It's expected that, as I tell my pastor sometimes because I travel so much, what's in your hands, Luke? I'm obligated to support the parish. I'm not obligated necessarily to be in that particular church every Sunday because I travel so much. But we do have an obligation to support the parish.
He still did that himself.
He's already got the automated withdrawal.
Father John is a rock star.
Yeah, he is. So I think there are two things in the Catholic mind and heart that work in favor, and I've just seen it over and over again. That people, when we tap those things, or when they're tapped, the stuff rolls out. And I was thinking, while you were showing the picture of Cathedral of Mary Queen, I was thinking, I grew up very close to that church. And just even that photograph, seeing it again, a friend of mine was recently named a Monsignor. The ceremony was there. I just went to Archbishop Board's funeral there. And they're doing some work. There was some construction problems in the back, And I just looked at that picture and I thought, this is not the desire, this is not the fundraiser, this is me, the Catholic, responding, I need to send a check. So again, I think there's something that as Catholics, there's a disposition that can be tapped. And again, I can't speak for other denominations, but I do know that, again, I think for me, it goes back to that objective sense of beauty, truth, and goodness that are inseparable.
And I think also that the thoughtful design, I think, too, is something that plays a huge role in that. at the cathedral, particularly if you're there in the morning, it's just the way that where they position the building, where the sun comes up, it just kind of slowly bathes the church. It's kind of like, it's limestone, and it just sort of has this very warm, you feel you're in the presence of God, and you just stand in front of this edifice without even going inside. And so those are the kind of things where, and that can be done obviously with interiors as well. And so I think lay people, as you said, you don't need to have a degree in, in architectural or liturgical design to kind of understand this is a beautiful and thoughtful place to be, which puts you in the right mind frame for what you're there in the first place for.
Question for you guys. So we've got a couple people involved in fundraising. Obviously, some people a lot of time and others. So what are you guys here for? You came because of my plea to come to the workshops? Or what is your interest in fundraising? What brings you to this room instead of the other room today?
Well, I'm a seminarian, and so I'm sure I'll be happy to do this.
Gotcha. Exactly.
So one of my questions that comes up is, at what point does it stop being feasible for a pastor to spearhead a fundraising effort and become necessary to hire a firm like CCS or do something like that? What's the dividing line?
I would be very concerned if you just donated.
Fix that toilet, you
Father dodged the bullet. You got lucky. I think, as you mentioned earlier, when you look at the scope of what a project is, and when it's a project, even, and all things are proportional. I mean, you could be at a parish that, has 200 families and a big old rambling place that probably used to be full 60 years ago, and the neighborhood's changed. So I think it's a function of, it always has to be, at least from our perspective, it needs to be very cost efficient. It needs to be, the idea of the reason why you hire the 800-pound gorilla like CCS is that we come in and bring a lot of expertise and bring full-time staff to go work on the project. So that, for example, we're doing a campaign down in Bluffton, South Carolina. So they're at $5.8 million in debt for the parish plant that they have. Now, they made the parish and diocese made a conscious decision to build out this whole space because it was going through this amazing growth. So at the time when they built it, I think there were 300 families, now there's 2,900. It led like a 7 or 8 year period, so it's gone through this amazing growth, but now they have this huge receipt that they have to pay. But that's something where, even a project like that, where we have to look at what we would normally have one of our professionals. She's down there full-time, on site, 5 days a week. Her job is really we use the term campaign director, and the word director is very much like what director means when you direct a film. You have your hands on everything. And the idea is how, in a big project, the idea is to try to maximize not only, your role, because you're running a parish, which is, a lot of people, lay people don't realize it's a small business unto itself. It could be $1 million, $2 million operation. That's not always a lot of thinking to think coming out of the seminary. Like, go run a $2 million business? You might, with a lot of customers. So I think usually when it's more modest and proportionate, or if there's, for example, like Father mentioned, there might have been a couple people that were really passionate about that. So if that's the case, you might not need that. If it's something that is really broad-based, it's going to involve the whole entire parish. The parish is sizable enough. The main reason why you're getting professional counsel is just a couple of reasons. One, that it's done in a kind of sophisticated and dignified way. It's done in the least amount of time possible. You want to do this in a highly efficient way. It's also done in a way that allows everybody to understand why we're doing this, and that's the benefit of having, somebody that's their only focus. Whereas you're running the parish, other folks have their own jobs and commitments. So that's the benefit of having a professional there, is they have some track record of experience, hopefully. They understand the culture of the place and they respect it. So I mean, it's different types of things. I think it's a significant enough process, it becomes kind of obvious that we need to have a professional involved. Just like when you're doing a small renovation, do we need to have an architect, or is it something that's more of a contractor kind of thing? And I think
I should always hire an architect.
Right, I would probably just say, well,
That's what you said that. I mean, it's really one reason we have this sort of range of, I think you guys are going to face, I mean, it seems to me a range of things that are 100 million, 100,000, not 100 million, maybe it's few, but $100,000 projects to $10 million projects. And so it's really interesting, the kind of range here. One thing I think, your father used to say, well, we didn't really do any fundraising in a way, but as you were talking and all this conversation, it seems to me like when people have a kind of a spiritual formation they like they're feeling this place is feeding me, if that's the right word, and then they see something they like architecturally, boy, boom, all of a sudden, you know, so they're presented with a picture in the front of the church here or at St. Peter's, and all of a sudden they're like, well, I love this place, and wow, I really like that. Of course, then you have to have a person with money, so somebody out there. So in a way, it's kind of this way of being that's really feeding them and then giving them something good, something beautiful. Seems to be a very powerful way of kind of fundraising in some way.
Yeah, it was an organized effort, but
There are stars like Monsignor Ensler who are they're good priests. They're also good fundraisers, and this is, you know, but they're also, you know, there are lots of clergy who are good about being clergy and they're good priests. But even if you might be a good fundraiser, you have to have the time. And again, what I've observed sometimes in some parishes where the pastor will try to tackle something and sort of keep it in-house, it drags out, it becomes labored, and again, it compromises, sometimes it can compromise the position of the priest as spiritual leader. Right? It's not that he can't be, because the pastor is responsible, but I think I've seen it really wear on a lot of clergy, you know, to have to take this on. And
we usually find it's very effective where, like anything else, the pastor's the head of the parish, so he titularly has that role. But I think one of the things that we always sort of train when we're having a meeting here, and Father we're at his church, you know, one of the things that we say is, you know, this is not Father's campaign, this is your campaign. You know, and he's the steward of the parish right now. But this is something that you all need to be involved in. And like anything else, leadership by example. So if the pastor can step up and do, based on their availability, do at least what they're asking other people to do. You know, and that's the kind of thing if somebody, you know, either personality-wise or demeanor-wise, they're generally either uncomfortable, maybe not skilled for that, then you can, if you compare the pastor with somebody who they're comfortable with, there can be a genuine partnership where it's saying, here's why we're doing this. Here's how we want to change how the crucifix looks and how the altar's moved around. This is how originally was. Oh, it's really interesting. And then I'm with Father and he's saying, Dave, that's why we want to ask you and your wife, could you consider supporting what we're doing for X, Y, whatever it might be. So it should be a partnership.
As you go into older dioceses where you're going to see consolidations and closure of parishes, how has that changed the fundraising dynamic, and what would you advise parish leaders when you led parishes and you're trying to kind of address a different sense of both stewardship and loss at the same time?
Yeah, that's tough. Because I've obviously been in a couple of situations, or I was in the Diocese of Rochester where you might have one pastor be in charge of 2 or 3 parishes. And so that was a tough thing where you, in some cases there where they might have had at one time 2 or 3 masses, now they were just going to have 1. So in some cases they have to kind of still balance the identity of the place. And then when you do have sort of 2 combining, that's where it's really challenging, where you have to kind of remind people, and this is the tough thing, you're not going to make everybody happy, but in terms of raising money, in terms of the regular offertory giving, you have to kind of remind people too that, you know, we're not about this building or this address. And that's a tough conversation to have with folks, to say, you know, hey, we worship in the middle of the field, you know, that's where a lot of us, where we started from. So it's the idea is let's not get caught up in just the edifice itself. But I think it's if you can be respectful of, if some elements can be maintained, if there's things that you can do that still engage people, but make them understand the greater community. But it's very challenging. It's something we're going to face more and more, particularly in the Northeast.
David,
Yes.
would you tell them about St. Anne's, how that worked in Burnsville?
Oh.
They combined parishes.
Oh, there was Archdiocese of Baltimore 25 years ago. The Archdiocese decided, without any consultation, to merge 2 parishes. 2 very different parishes, 2 Western Maryland towns, small town, rural. So St. Stephen's in Grantsville and St. Anne's in Appleton were suppressed, and there was then St. Anne's Bransfield. They never got along. These people never wanted it. They were, again, two very different, you had one was mostly agricultural, another was coal mining, and so there were cultural differences, all kinds of differences, ethnic differences. More Germans in one place, more Irish over here. And for whatever reason, God decided that there would be a fire 2 years ago on Christmas Eve, or the week before Christmas, and St. Anne's Church, that was built 25 years ago, burned to the ground. The response at first was, well, there's plenty of insurance money, we can rebuild this place, and no problem. But what began to happen was, and it's a different situation than, 3 parishes, like the parish I grew up in, closing and merging, that kind of thing. However, it was a tremendous opportunity for fundraising, and so beyond the insurance, what they needed, actually both communities really started to rally, and some of the people that weren't coming to St. Anne's from the other places that were headed in other directions, some people were going to Pennsylvania, some people were going to West Virginia, they actually began to sort of come together and at least hear what the potential might be. So then we were called to, we were asked by the pastor and the director of liturgy in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. It sounds like it's a mercenary kind of effort here, but it really wasn't. Spiritually, really, to spend some time, we did a retreat, a little couple-day retreat. What could unify this place? And so we came up with the idea that the crucifix above the altar in this church would be painted in sort of a traditional Renaissance, Italian Renaissance manner. On the 2 wings of the cross, where you might have patrons or patron saints or some benefactor in the 13th century, we had the 2 churches painted, the original 2 churches painted. And then from St. Paul in the big panel below our Lord's feet, by his wounds you are healed. This crucifix then became essentially the center of a fundraising program, which was very successful. The diocese was there. We just had a person from the diocese that wasn't an outsider who came in, but it was very effective. And I've heard that in some places in Chicago where they've done some merging, sometimes something like literally a piece of art can pull people together. And it was a powerful symbol, and the church is not crowded. I mean, they came back. It's not just because of that. There's a good pastor, good leadership, and their collections are way up. I mean, they're really successful.
We have time for a couple more. I'll hear from a couple other people who haven't said anything. Why are you here? Or what's your question?
Well, I was just going to dovetail on that.
Yeah.
We're working on some restoration in Chicago, and we found that fundraising comes from outside of the parish. We actually have the neighborhood, people who are not Catholic, giving to the project because the church is such a strong symbol of their particular ward. And so when the Archdiocese of Chicago and one project we're working on decided they were going to tear down this building, the aldermen and the residents of the community had an uproar and protested this, and they got the city of Chicago and Mayor Daley in particular to designate the church as a landmark, which the church could then not tear down. So you had this conflict now between church and state, which eventually resolved itself, and the church is being restored. But people from outside of the parish often give to a historic structure because they want to see it restored. Maybe that's what you saw in Baltimore with the Basilica. But was that the other thing? The other point I wanted to make was about the time frame. I was glad that you mentioned that, because for a lot of small parishes and parishes where you may be stationed someday, you don't have the advantage of wealth. You don't have the advantage of a community of people where 2 or 3 donors give millions of dollars. You're going to be dealing with Latinos. You're going to be dealing with immigrants who give pennies. And we're working on one project where the fundraising aspect has to be handled by the pastor. There's no money to bring in another company to run that. And he's been raising money for 4.5 years. And then after 4.5 years, this is for a small Latino, well, it's a large Latino. Their mass has 900 people, Latinos at 12 million. But it took them 4.5 years to raise $90,000. So time is something that you have to be patient with for a lot of these. For most, I'd say 90% of the projects that you're going to be dealing with, the parishes. Then you have the other constriction of the fact that priests are stationed for only, 6 years sometimes. So the whole idea of father has changed. And therefore, are you going to pass that campaign on to the next priest? Or are you going to be restationed there because you're in the middle of a campaign? I mean, there are all these other political issues that come up with this because of time. It's something that you're going to have to really think about. And when you're planning a campaign for a parish that doesn't have the wealthy clientele, the wealthy parishioners in that area. So I thought that was great because time really, and I think the attitude has changed. I think a lot of people really sense that I don't have to be alive even. I don't have to be around to see this church finished. I'm building it not for me, I'm building it for the glory of God. So I think that's an important aspect that has to be presented to some clientele or some of your parishioners who say, well, I want to see that when it's done. I want to see my name on the plaque. And I think, at least our experience is we've seen that attitude is changing. And now people who are donating recognize that this church may take 10 or 15 years to build, as opposed to instant gratification and having it done in 10 months, 11 months. So I think that is an important aspect to consider, and that's changed a lot from the 80s when there was a lot of instant gratification, at least in my opinion.
It's fascinating. There's a lot of time on many different levels. Other,
Some of you have mentioned the importance of inspiring people for these big campaigns for building projects. What about maintenance campaigns? Just keeping enough money in the parish coffers. I see in the parishes I've worked at that oftentimes the pastor uses the stewardship approach, which is supposed to be, I think, religious, but it ends up becoming, well, this is what we need to do to keep the lights on, which is not very inspiring. And I think it's important to have kind of transparency with parish bills and expenses. I would say, like, for the big snowstorm we had here in D.C., and a lot of parishes spent $20,000-$30,000 removing snow from the parking lots. But if you're just doing that, and I find a lot of pastors just do that, you're not really uplifting people that this is for the glory of God.
It's the big challenge for the next 50 years. In our diocese, none of our parishes have sinking funds to establish a maintenance addendum. And if there's any one thing that parish leadership needs to look at now, it's how parishes will survive for the next century. And I think that we need to have a much different attitude about how you build that kind of endowment so that the next 2 or 3 generations of parishioners will have the same experience physically and spiritually in that particular place.
And we found in our work, we have a studio, supply, mosaics and glass, all sorts of things you don't need. But, and I always say, we supply luxury items to a charity. And you would think that would be a hard sell. But we often find that it's a good fundraiser, and it can be something that people don't want to give to fixing the roof. But if you do that at the same time as you're raising money for something pretty, it's a lot more fun and often more effective, and actually raises money for the necessities.
Miracles really come. I should say money becomes a miracle. We have seen churches that didn't even have a pastor, and they want something done. And it's very simple. And you do one thing and then it just starts to grow. But one little church, we're doing some windows for them, and it started off, they had a large window at the back of the church so the priest couldn't see. There's people in it, and they put a rolled black curtain on to cover it. So somebody said this was really ugly, that we should fix that. So we went in and did a very simple fix with some glass that was inexpensive, but it cut down the light and it controlled that. So, and it started to change the interior of the building very nicely. So the next thing happened, somebody said, well, now that we've done that, I think we need something behind the altar. I think that window should be there. So there was money came for that, and there was anonymous somebody. So that was done. So then we get another call. There's all the windows down the side. Everybody that wanted to do that. So they kept coming and said, Mr. Dixon, where else can we put windows? Well, they've only got a few places left. We can do the transformers. We'll do those with somebody. Then they came in, is there any more? No, let's be break open some holes in the wall. But those are miracles. And you see them we see it so much in small churches. We had one, where they wanted to bring in some local artisan to do some stuff, and fortunately the bishop said, no, you go get Dixon Studios. And because as you well know, here in architect, whatever part of the situation where you can destroy a building with bad art, and you can make a whole building, simple building by putting good art in it. It makes all the difference. But anyway, the point I was saying, sometimes you'll get people who are so much against doing anything, but they end up being your greatest advocate at the end. And so it's a strange phenomenon. And as far as, raising money is a funny thing when you look at it. The money is there. It's really there. And it's just that over years, people just not used to put it out on the table. And it's not really one thing that gets them excited. It's, because I think, as you're right, as the priests are moved along, you get a different personality brought in. And churches over the years are a lot like a home. They just get things added to it, mismatched, and it gets dowdy, and nobody really pays attention to it. They just go in, and as one priest said, Ron will just walk over it. They'll never see that crap. They'll just walk over it. And that's, unless you get somebody who, you'll get a priest who'll be conscious of that and realize that something's not right with the church. If you go into it, you'll see that indeed, over the years, it's just been a mix. Everybody wants to give it to the church, they'll use it, And it's interesting how they just don't see it. It's like you go back to your mother's home, and you say, oh my gosh, still got all those old things, But it's, when I say the money's there, the interest there, you just have to bring them to it. And how you bring them to it is there's a lot of different ways, and sometimes it is just the presence of a new priest coming in and say, wow, we need to do something. And it's as simple as saying, this is the house of God, it has to be beautiful. This, we take care of it with the word, with music, now we need visual. And, and most of the arts, those are the silent, the silent homilies, people get also. The saddest thing to see in some churches when we walk in, especially a new church, and there's nothing there. You could be at your dentist's office. It's just nothing. And then people, and especially I feel sorry for people who spent the money to build that beautiful church from the outside. And I'll say this to our architects: you do like the curb appeal, but I've always said a church has to be designed from the inside, especially a Catholic church, and I think David, it has to be designed from the inside out, and it has to work, and it has to, So
we're being descended upon because we're going to need to wrap up with lunch.
The Dixon companies here, they're also liturgical designers. What is a liturgical designer? Well, we're not architects. I certainly have a couple of architects that work with me. But we're people who have a strong knowledge of theology. We know how liturgy stems from theology, and a very strong working knowledge of liturgy and how that then relates to the guidelines that have been set down by the Bishops' Conference, both the Living Stones and then also the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. What I'm going to do is talk to you about what I consider the real process of working with the parish and designing or renovating the church. When you get into the trenches and you go into every parish, it's hard to generalize because each parish is unique. What happens is you go in and You begin to hear about a scope of work, and you talk with the pastor. Sometimes you have finance. We always have a finance committee. You have along the way sometimes a task force committee, sometimes a planning committee, and then there are all the review committees within the diocese, and that varies from time to time. So the first things you have to do is to try to understand who it is you're working for. There are a lot of voices involved in the scope of work. It's not just a matter of going in and talking to the priest or talking to a planning committee and beginning to try to put a space together. Now, a liturgical designer is interested in how the different liturgies and all the seasons, liturgical seasons of the year, work within the space itself. So when you're a liturgical designer, you design from the inside out, not from the outside in, as architects do. Unfortunately, what has happened to me too many times is I've been asked to come into churches when the process is too far along, and it's, can you clean up this mess? Or we've got the space, and well, we're about halfway through, or we're about 90% through the drawings, but it doesn't function, and now all of a sudden we don't know what we're doing. I'm really grateful for this symposium, because I think that the more architects become aware of the real guidelines within the church and the real needs of liturgy, the better it is. For me, the best process to start with is a collaboration between the architect, liturgical designer, and the pastor. If you get a good team starting from the very beginning, you save time, you save money, and it's really critical, particularly in this day, to stay on budget. I meet with a lot of committees. I meet, I meet in their meeting rooms. I meet sometimes with churches. Sometimes I'll be called in by a bishop who has decided that something's going on in the parish and he doesn't like it. You've got to try to be politic about it and figure out a way to see if you can steer things around. Again, these are the two documents that we use all the time, both Living Stones and the General Instruction. I'm fortunate enough because I have a board of advisors, and two of our advisors, one is Monsignor James Maroney, who was the Director of Liturgy for the Bishops' Conference for about 8 years, until about a year ago, and Sister Janet Baxendale, who's the Director of Liturgy for the Cardinal in New York, Archdiocese. And they help a lot. Now, when we get into trying to figure out just what the direction we're going to go, and there's been a tremendous way, I've heard this stated this morning in several different ways, there's this movement that's been happening within the last 10 years, particularly within the last 5 or 6, going back, from what was considered, to use Mr. Vesco's terminology, to get away from the over-the-counter approach to churches and to go back to tradition. Now, tradition means a lot of things. And if you go into a church and you talk to a pastor, you talk to any 5 people on a planning committee, they'll each have a different idea of what that means. So an exercise that I've used a number of times is something like this. I'll take any number of images and I'll take a single subject like the crucifixion. I won't present them like this, but I'll frame them. I'll stick them out in the gathering space. And for 2 or 3 weeks, early on in the planning process, this is all part of the parish education process, I'll just put these out and I'll ask the question, would you choose your first, second, and third choice of what you like best? Now, these are just images I ran took off the internet. But what's been very interesting to me is that within a very short time, you have this and a couple of other exercises, and you can really figure out where the parish is coming from. Or if there is a problem within the parish, you can move that to the surface. Sometimes I go through an exercise where I just show them different churches, so that beginning the communication, the whole idea is to get the parish to buy into the process. There's always going to be issues. There always are. Some people say, you know, it's just perfect the way it is. Some want to modernize the church. Some want to, you know, make it the Hagia Sophia. So you just kind of have to go through a process. Obviously, you go through, you begin a kind of iterative design process when you get into it. You begin to sketch. You begin to talk about logistics. This is, to me, the most crucial part of the whole operation to begin with. I'm working on a church right now down in South Carolina, and I was called about 2 weeks ago, and the pastor had been working with this particular firm, and he said, I'm in a mess. Nothing is working. I wanted windows. I don't have a single window. I wanted to be next to the people. I'm as far away as I can possibly be. I have no sacristy. The vestry is you know, it's at the other end of where it should be, because, you know, most of the time now priests process from the back of the church forward. He was very frustrated. So we began talking over the phone, and I sent him some sketches, and he said, we're pouring concrete. And so they actually got in the next morning. They changed some of the way they were pouring the concrete. Usually, we get in before that moment. But what really surprises me is that the diocese, when they choose a list of architects, they don't necessarily look at the credentials of the architect, the ones that have had the experience, have had the training. Unfortunately, maybe it's because in this area we're too close to the government, you know, they tend to go toward the lowest bidder. And they get unsatisfactory results, and then all kinds of difficulties happen. Now, this is going to be a tool I was going to try to illustrate for you, but unfortunately it's not working. This is a tool that I use a lot in the parish, because a lot of times we'll go in and we'll do master planning, and we'll do, many times, town hall meetings. This is what I call a 360. I set up a camera in the middle, and if it were working, I could take my mouse and I could move it backward and forward, and I could give you a view of the entire church and the ceiling and everything else. But for some reason, it works at the office, but it's not working here. What's nice about this is that when you're in a committee room, such as this room, and you're meeting, or if you're in a gymnasium talking to the parish, you can remind them what the church looks like, because most of the time, when they're out of the space, there's a lot of confusion that happens. They may have lived in the parish for 40 years, but they won't remember certain details. It's a great way to get the discussion going.
Yeah, the arrow.
Now this is a situation that was quite interesting to me, and was a real struggle. I was asked by the diocese to visit this particular church. There's a long tradition of kind of difficult and lax practices that went on in this particular parish. And as you see the original altar, pre-Vatican II altar that they use as a Reredos here. And then you'll see some bleachers kind of in front of that, right in this area. And you see a grand piano. Then you go down some steps, and then actually you go up some steps, and you see this kind of makeshift altar and ambo. And over here, there's a swimming pool that was, you know, for the baptismal font. And right in here are chairs if they have a reason for special people to be sitting there, not necessarily ministers. Then the priest sits over here, on the side. He doesn't sit in the center. And the scope of the project was, we work as a parish. We only do things by consensus. We've been trying, and as architects stood up and told me this, I have been trying for 9 years, for 9 years, trying to bring this parish to consensus. And nothing would happen. Now, part of the problem was, on the planning committee, they had 5 more architects. So there were too many different probably ideas. But in fact, they were frustrated at that point so much that they really needed some help. So the way to do that is you go outside. And so I came in, I started meeting with them once about every 2 weeks. And I started with this kind of an exercise over here. You see all these different colored buttons. Those were different talking points of how you move around the space and things that could happen and where the handicap ramp should be and so forth. And I wasn't getting anywhere. All I was doing was putting out fires because the parish was absolutely determined that there was going to be a redesign of the church, and it had already been done, and I was just simply going through the motions. So the next thing that I tried, I came up with this kind of paper doll house. And this was a little paper model, just about this big. And I put it on a table. I started meeting every other Sunday afternoon. And I literally put it right here. And I had a screen right up here and a projector. And I would begin by telling them what should happen and the reason for positioning things in certain places and how what do you need for a funeral, what do you need for a wedding, what do you need for Easter, and how you have all the different processions of the liturgy and how they interact and so forth. And then they responded by explaining to me that they had a dance group, and they had a theater company, and they did musical concerts, and so we had to accommodate them too. So we took all of that into consideration. In any case, by the use of this electronic model and the paper model, it took 9 months, but we brought them to consensus, and this renovation is now going forward. It would have been a total waste of time without going through this effort. So it's very important to get on the same way. Now here's a situation down in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I was called by the head of the task force because in this case, they were working with an architect. And I got to say, the architect had done an absolutely beautiful job. They wanted, this was their church, this was their space. And this back wall actually was quite beautiful. It's 1970 baked enamel relief that was done by some artists from Seville. It was really quite nice. But the space itself was a hodgepodge. You can see all these attempts at pasted stained glass and so forth. You can see them over here as well. Well, I was called down there because the man said, the priest said, well, we are $1 million on the budget. Can you give us what the architect gave us? Can you work with him and take $1 million out of the budget and give us the same feeling? So we did. We started working with him. And the first thing I did was, I have to digress here a minute, because one of the things, I do have offices in Poland, and I have them in Spain and Italy, and one of the things that has helped me is not only to get artists and artisans to do the work, but I have a team of 8 Polish marble experts that are in this area, and some years I keep them busy, 12 months out of the year. Because up in New York and New Jersey, there have been so many churches that have closed because I think communities move out to the suburbs, they're no longer viable. So we will go in, and this team will go in and they'll remove the pieces and put them in the warehouses. And we've done this for a number of dioceses, and then in some instances we put them on our webpage to try to find new churches for them. Well, this happened to be a situation that was just kind of wonderful. Here was a church that needed something to begin with, something to get their teeth around, to really get excited about. And in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, was a church that had closed. And everything had been stripped out of the church except the baldacchino. And so I sent a team in there and we removed the baldacchino. And we redesigned it. We took out the mosaic panels because the folks in Shreveport didn't want the mosaic. We kept the ribbing in place. We removed the two finials and the cross at the top, simplified the design. And then we redesigned it in the space and over their altar. Now we blew out the ceiling. You know, this is a drop ceiling. So they were able to create this new barrel vault in the middle. I tried to get them to spend the extra money to put in the scissors trucks up there so they wouldn't have these beams across here, but that didn't work. They're actually talking about doing something now after the fact. Anyway, we went through a lot of these electronic models, and so now this is what happened. This is the old church. Here's the baldacchino that we took out of Mount Carmel. We redesigned it in the new church. We suspended a new crucifix through the baldacchino. We carved a new altar, new ambo, new baptismal font, new statuary, new, you know, everything. And they reopened the church a year and a half later. What happened right at the last moment, we were literally getting ready, the contracts were getting ready to be back. And I got a call from the priest. I was down at the beach, and I was having vacation with my family, and he said, we're in deep trouble. The city just called us and said we needed all new water mains and all new electrical feeds because they have this huge complex building. They just added $1 million to our budget. So can you put some models together for us in literally 2 weeks? And I said, well, I can do a presentation. And this is about a 4-minute film. It doesn't take very long. Again, I'm interested only on the inside here, but you'll see what happened. I sent this down to them, and the priest, it comes complete with Gregorian music. After Mass, he set this up, a screen right in the sanctuary, and he played this after every Mass. And he said, this is what we want to do. Of course, this doesn't have the same detail. We took the old piece and put it in the gathering space, so as you walked out, you could see it. This is what we want, or the idea of what we want to do. Told them the story about the city and said, we need to ask you for another $1 million. Well, the bishop told them, this was in October, he was retiring in late January, and he said, if you can get pledges for $1 million and you get $800,000 in cash in the bank before I retire, I'll sign the document. They showed this at each Mass. When Mass was over, they started getting calls and people writing checks. They got $3 million worth of pledges. January 17th, they had $800,000 in the bank. January 18th, the bishop resigned. He signed just before he signed the paper. So they, you know, there are a lot of tools, and you know, the architects and all of you who've used these, you know how important this kind of a tool is to really make it happen.
Michael, if I could just ask you, I would just say, for me, those of you who were in the fundraising this morning, this is exactly where the design process and fundraising process goes together. You can see it in every fundraising story. People see something they really like, all of a sudden, the funds, you know, not all of a sudden, it takes work, but it makes it possible for money that was just...
Well, I'll give you a footnote to this. There was a committee, there were 5 committees I worked with in this parish. And there was this one committee, and they absolutely insisted they were going to have stained glass. Well, they had no money for stained glass. By themselves, they, through potluck suppers and everything, they raised $75,000. So I convinced them to spend $25,000 of that to have, they have 24 windows, to do a set of watercolors of the windows. They did. You know, you never allow memorials to happen until the campaign is done. And then what happened was they put these images in the gathering space, actually the gymnasium where they were meeting temporarily. in 2 weeks, they had sold every one of them. They had budgeted $300,000 of what they needed. They actually ended up getting over $700,000. So they were adding windows and all kinds of things. So it really does happen. And this as a tool is very, you can stop this, you can use this in meetings and everything. So it has a wonderful multi-purpose.
What purposes?
What?
What purposes?
This is SketchUp. Yeah, and then, you can see that the images are boxes and paste ups and all that. I'm very fortunate in the talent that I've got working for me. This was a little chapel the size of basically just a space placeholder. They have Adoration Chapel. All right, so now, it's important, as I say, to keep the buy-in all the way through. Communication is absolutely critical with the parish. So there are all kinds of liturgies that happen. You're all familiar with the groundbreaking ceremony. There's one ceremony that I've introduced that, actually I got it from Monsignor Moroni, it wasn't my own, but it's a great ceremony to introduce to a client, particularly if there's a renovation going on. And the idea is that as you close the church for the last time as a community, you process with the Blessed Sacrament out of the church. The priest carries it across to the temporary place, could be a gymnasium or whatever, and they ensconce the Blessed Sacrament in a temporary tabernacle. So it's this kind of ritual. And then when they have the dedication, you have that same procession back. And so that it's the parish officially with the bishop and the priest, they're all part of it. And of course, these other pictures here, this happens to be Our Lady of Hope church out at Potomac Falls. It shows the scenes from the dedication. We did a lot of statuary and iconography. Sometimes you have very interesting things that occur that take you a bit by surprise. I got a call. Again, some things happen in the fall. I guess people are getting ready for Christmas or something. And it's from the Vicar General of the Parish of the Diocese down in West Virginia. And he said, we have a problem down here. We've got a church and they're under construction. And everything in the sanctuary is wood. Now, we don't want to change their design, but we need it to be in marble. And the bishop is insistent. And he'll put a little extra money into it, but the due date is November, and it's got to be done. And I said, well, it can't be done. I can't do it. I can do certain things. But anyway, I got him to relax the date to January. And so this is what we did. We put in a new marble floor and did all of this work. Again, those are not our designs. Well, the baptismal fonts are our design. Well, we did design it. I guess it is our design, but it was a modification of what they already had. I can't take full credit for that. Here's my home parish church, and it shows there was a huge struggle. As you can see over here to the side, the whole church was cement block. When it opened, there wasn't a single image in the church, not even a cross. There was a picnic table here at the side. Off to one side, the floor was wood, blonde wood. There was a kind of a wooden lectern over here. And the shock when the parishioners came in there was just unbelievable. Well, it took 16 years and a lot of struggle in the parish before they could make their voices heard and actually get something changed. And they kept the same fabric of the building and all. But as you can see, there's a parochial wall over here. There's a Eucharistic chapel here. And we brought in You know, the whole idea of materials, of stone, of permanence and everything, and the idea that everything in the church should focus not on the organ as it did before, but on the altar. You know, and if you have lighting in the church, you know, when the mass is going on, the light should be on the altar. It shouldn't be anyplace else. But this has got a nice lighting system in here now. When they have other services, they light up the crucifix, and then at mass it's diminished.